I want to welcome everyone today to our Friday Flash Talk, the Archaeological Dig at Notion, with Christopher Ratté, a professor in the Classical Studies Department at the University of Michigan. In this Flash Talk, Christopher Ratté will discuss the most recent season of fieldwork at the site, highlighting the ongoing excavation, study, and conservation of Notion's civic, residential, and surrounding areas. Christopher Ratté is the director of the Notion Archaeological Project and professor of ancient Mediterranean art and archaeology at the University of Michigan. After his presentation, we will have a time for questions, so hold your questions till then. You can put them in the chat or unmute yourselves, but until then, please keep yourselves muted. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to throw it over to Professor Ratté.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Can everyone hear me? Am I audible?
Yep, I can hear you.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I have 15 minutes here, and I'm going to try to make the most of them, and launch right into the subject. So Notion is situated in Western Turkey, and that's the part of the world shown in the map on the right-hand side of your screen. And the site is right here. It's obviously a coastal site, as is obvious from the picture on the left. Now I have to remember how to advance my slides. Here we go. Here's an aerial view of the site. So it occupies two promontories projecting into the Aegean Sea. And in the, I'm going to run the cursor basically around the edges of the city here. So it goes up like this, more or less where the modern road goes, and then down around this other promontory. The total area of the site is about 80 acres. So that's twice the size of the central campus of the University of Michigan. We've been working at the site for a decade now. So we started in 2014, and our research has been divided basically into two phases. The first was archaeological survey, so that's archaeology without digging. And we had 5 seasons of field work between 2014 and 2018, and then a study season in 2019. Then, of course, the pandemic intervened. We went back for a very short season in 2021, and then wrapped up that part of the project. And it's now in the process of publication. So what we did basically was to map the city using a number of different techniques and to collect artifacts on the surface of the city throughout the town. And I'm going to show you some general pictures just to give you a sense of the landscape, and then I will talk a little bit about our findings. So here's the theater at Notion. Let me go back to the previous picture so that the theater is right here on the eastern side of the city. This is a picture looking southward toward the sea. So you have it's a grid plan town. I think that was obvious from the map, and it exhibits all the typical features of a Greek city. It has a central marketplace. It has big civic and commercial buildings, sacred buildings, so theater, temples, all the basic buildings that constitute the civic and commercial and religious heart of a Greek city, and then, of course, extensive residential neighborhoods. Here's one of the temples. So we could tell from our survey that it was a Greek city, that it was a grid plan town, that it was enclosed by massive fortifications, and that it had the kinds of buildings you would expect from a Greek city, like the ones you've just seen pictures of. We know about this town from literary sources, textual sources, ancient writers like the Greek historian Thucydides, the Roman historian Livy, and other authors. That's how we know the name of the city. And they tell us a little bit about its history. They tell us that it was established around 500 BC, and that it continued to exist in one form or another for almost 1,000 years, so until the early Christian era. Now, the principal finding of our survey was that in spite of this long period of existence attested by texts, what was visible in the form of archaeological evidence on the surface, buildings that were still visible, like the fortifications and the theater, and then the artifacts that we collected. What the archaeological evidence seemed to indicate was that the occupation of the city was much shorter than the textual sources suggested. So we see very little evidence. We saw, on the basis of the survey, very little evidence for any habitation on this site before the 3rd century BC, so before the 200s BC. And then the site seems to have been largely abandoned in the 1st century AD, so between 0 and 100 AD. So what the archaeology seems to indicate is that the main period of habitation at the site only lasted for about 300 years, even if the community existed in some form for close to 1,000 years. So that was an interesting conundrum. And what we wanted to do once we had finished our survey was to take the next step in archaeological research, which is excavation, to explore the findings of the survey, to see if excavation gave the same results of the survey as the survey or different results. So we started excavation in 2023 after long and complex negotiations with the Turkish Ministry of Culture. We were issued, 2022, we were issued a permit to begin excavations in collaboration with a university in Turkey called Sinop University on the Black Sea. And the co-director of the project is Hazar Kaba, an associate professor of archaeology at Sinop University, and he is assisted. The second co-director is Merve Sultan Çakan Özarabacı, who is a graduate, PhD graduate of Adnan Menderes University in Aydın. So although I'm the one doing the talking this afternoon, I want to make it very clear that our work is it's a product of teamwork, and I'm really speaking not just for myself but for all my colleagues, and especially my Turkish colleagues. So before proceeding further, let me just go back to the map, if I can figure out how to do that, and tell you where our excavations have focused and what I'm going to tell you about over the next about 10 minutes. So I said before that when you look at the surface archaeology of Notion, what you see very clearly are conventional civic, commercial, and religious buildings like the theater, like the temples. But of course, most of the city was made up of the houses of its residents. And we could see the basic outlines of these houses. Just their foundations were preserved in a number of places. And most of the artifacts that we picked up on the surface were refuse from habitation of the houses. But we couldn't really get beyond a kind of general understanding of the residential side of life in this city from survey. So we wanted to make that a primary focus of excavations. And we began with excavation of a house right here, if you can see the cursor, just to the west of the Agora. And I'd call it a Peristyle House, which means it's a courtyard house with a kind of columnar courtyard in the center. The other focus of our excavations is on the other side of the Agora, and it is one of the civic buildings of the city, the Bouleuterion, the council house, the main town hall of the city. So I'll start with the Peristyle House and then tell you about the Bouleuterion. So here's a little video of this house. Let's see if I can stop it in midstream. This is the line of a street. So, this has not been excavated. This is just what you can see on the surface. That's one of the remarkable things about Notion, is how legible the basic outline of the city is on the surface. So here's a street, and on the north side of that street, I think you can see a square area here surrounded by foundations. That's the courtyard, and those foundations are for the columns of the porticos that faced onto the courtyard. And then around that house, like this, is a series of rooms enclosing the courtyard on all sides. So this is where we started work. The size of the house, it's a square building, 18 meters. That's about 60 feet along a side. So it's about a 60 by 60 foot plot, which is a large house by any standards. Of course, that does include the open area, the unroofed area of the courtyard. So this video was made at a pretty early stage in the excavations in 2022. You see the blue boxes that we use to collect artifacts, the rubber buckets that we use to transport earth from the excavations into wheelbarrows that then go and the earth is dumped in a pile here and then later on transported off the site. So here are the excavations in progress in 2023 as we got deeper through the whole building. And I'm just going to show you a restored drawing of a house of more or less the same time period on the Greek island of Delos, just to help you imagine kind of what this building looked like. Our building was less elaborate than this house. It didn't have this tower at one corner, but I showed you the initial picture of looking across the street to the building, the central courtyard, and this is basically the basic outline and volume of our house. Although we think it was just a single-storied house, not a double-storied house like this one, but just to give you some sense of its appearance. And here is an aerial photograph of the house taken after excavation was completed. So we finished digging the house in 2024 after 3 seasons of work. And I have outlined the 2 phases visible, or the 2 phases in the occupation of the house that were explored in our excavations in different colors, and then shown you the location of some objects found in the house. The yellow phase represents the latest phase of the house, which lasted from the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD, so what we call the Hellenistic period. And the artifacts found in the different rooms of this house help us identify how these rooms were used. So we had in room 2 lots of large flat-bottomed vessels, which suggest that this was used for food storage. In the porticos around the central courtyard, on the north and west sides in particular, so north and west, we found lots of amphoras, big jars. So these areas were presumably also used for food storage. In room 3 here, in the northwest corner of the house, there were lots of cooking pots, so that may have been the kitchen. In room 6, most of the fancy tableware, the dinner service of the house was found. So this seems to have been some kind of a pantry. So we can tell quite a bit about the use of the house in this phase, the Hellenistic phase, from the associated artifacts. And I want to single out my colleagues, Andrea Berlin, who just received the gold medal of the Archaeological Institute of America for distinguished archaeological achievement, and who is a graduate of the University of Michigan on the right, and a current student, Caroline Everts, and the 2 of them are working together on the pottery, and it's thanks to their research that I'm able to say what I just said about the use of the different rooms. Now, what was completely unexpected was another layer of occupation below the Hellenistic house. And here, too, pottery found in association with the walls that are shown here in blue enable us to date this habitation phase quite precisely to the late 5th century BC. So basically the last third of the 5th century BC. And in an area whose ancient function we don't know, it was underneath the courtyard of the Hellenistic house, we found nestled up against one of these early walls a small vessel called an olpi filled with gold coins, like the one that you see here on the right. And these are the Persian gold coins known as the darik. And they were deposited apparently during the era of the Peloponnesian War, which was the war between the Greek cities of Athens and Sparta for supremacy in Greece, and which involved cities like Notion, Greek cities on the western coast of Anatolia. The western coast of Anatolia was part of the Greek world in this period. You get about 15 miles inland, and you're in the Persian Empire. So the most of Turkey belonged to the Persian Empire in the 5th century BC, and the presence of the Persian Empire, looming over the border there, is very obvious in this hoard of gold coins. These coins were largely used and minted for the purpose of paying mercenary soldiers. One coin was worth a mercenary soldier's salary for a month. And we found, I'm not allowed to say exactly how many we found, but I can say that they would have paid the monthly salary of a substantial troop of soldiers. So it was a very significant sum of money. Obviously buried here for safekeeping, obviously never retrieved. And that's a clear sign of bad luck for whoever it was who buried these coins. And we think that this may be associated with events described by the Greek historian Thucydides at Notion during the Peloponnesian War, when the city was divided between supporters of the Athenians on the one hand and supporters of the Persian Empire on the other hand. That conflict was resolved when the Athenian military came and eliminated, captured, or killed the mercenary soldiers employed by the Persians to support the side, the faction within the city that was on the Persian side, and possibly the loss of these coins is associated with that event. So here's just a detail of one of these coins. Okay, so that's a pretty exciting discovery, and a really, really clear indication of why it's essential, when you can, to follow up archaeological survey with archaeological excavation. I'm going to proceed now briefly to say a little bit about the other area that's the major focus of work, which is the Bouleuterion here, and I think I'm already over time, so I'll try to be quick. So this is the council house. Here's a view of it. These are its outlines, and it's a rectangular building that encloses a rectilinear auditorium. Here is the plan of the building. So the picture that you saw, the video that you saw a moment ago, is taken from basically the lower left-hand corner of this plan, looking in this direction. So these are the outlines of the building. And then this is the rectilinear auditorium. And here you see a cross section, the outlines of the building here, the auditorium here. This is a common building type. Council houses in a number of other Greek cities of Western Anatolia are similar. Here you see the one at Notion, and here is one at the nearby city of Miletus. And here are reconstruction drawings of the Bouleuterion at Miletus, just to give you a better sense of what the comparable structure at Notion looked like. So an exterior view and an interior view. Obviously, the big difference between these two is that the Bouleuterion at Miletus had curvilinear as opposed to rectilinear seating. Now, a section of this building had been explored by the Turkish archaeologist Mustafa Büyükkoğlancı in the 1990s, and our first job was to clean out those earlier excavations. We did that in 2023. And then this last summer, we started to dig out the Bouleuterion. So Büyükkoğlancı had exposed the north side of the building, the north rank of seating. That would be to the left of this picture. And we're now digging the open area of the auditorium, and next year we will dig the south seats. The open area of the auditorium is quite interesting because in the center we found an altar. This shows last year's excavations at an early stage of excavation. And next to the altar, a statue base. So the picture you just saw is taken from this vantage point looking this way. Here's the altar, here's the statue base, here are the seats already exposed, here are the ranks of seats that remain to be exposed. And here's a detail of the statue base. It has an inscription, Greek inscription, which reads Kaisaros hilasteriou. That means of Caesar, the bringer of reconciliation. This is hilasterios, is quite a rare epithet, and it's only applied to the Roman Emperor Augustus. So it seems to be a statue dedicated to, erected in honor of Augustus after the end of the Roman civil wars, celebrating his success in not just overcoming his enemies, but achieving a kind of social reconciliation after that. The actual statue that stood on here was made of bronze. These are holes for its bronze feet, so the statue doesn't survive. So we're going to continue to excavate the Bouleuterion next year. Last set of pictures just say a little bit about our efforts to understand Notion in a broader regional context. So in addition to examining the city, we're looking at the cemeteries to the north and west of the city, at territorial fortifications to the northeast of the city, and at the infrastructure of the city, roads and the water supply. And we have been able to document an aqueduct that brought water along a ridge here and then under pressure in a siphon across the valley of this stream, which is called the Halys River, to Notion. Here's a view that shows the line of that aqueduct comes along these hills, goes down into the valley, and then comes up to the sanctuary of Athena. And the evidence for the aqueduct takes the form, among other things, of channels dug into the bedrock, into which were laid terracotta pipes. Okay, so we've had 3 field seasons at Notion so far, and we think they've been pretty successful. And that work has been supported. I mean, our work at Notion has been supported from the beginning by the Kelsey Museum, and I'm very grateful to the museum for that, and look forward to continued collaboration with the museum. The initial stage of work, first 3 seasons, were also funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. So many thanks to all American taxpayers for helping to fund our research. That grant is now finished, and in order to continue our work, we are going to need to find other sources of support, and Stephanie kindly gave me permission to use this presentation in part as a fundraising effort. So we are creating a fundraising group, sort of like the members of the Kelsey Museum, which I'm calling the Friends of Notion. And if you have any interest in joining the Friends of Notion, please send me an email and I will send you a newsletter and solicitation. So just a few pictures of our staff to end, and I think I've gone on for longer than I was supposed to, but I hope there'll still be time for questions. So I'm just going to now wait for questions. You can go ahead and turn on your microphones.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
You're welcome.
And yes, I invite questions at this point, so please feel free to unmute yourselves and go ahead and ask your question, or you can put it in the chat.
Suzanne, I see you have your hand raised, so.
I do. Thank you, Chris. That was a really great talk. I am wondering if you have any ideas, or if you would be willing to speculate on the extent of the classical phase at Notion.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. We know the limits of the Hellenistic city because it's surrounded by fortifications. The archaeological survey really didn't give us much help in determining the spatial extent of earlier habitation, because it gave us almost no evidence of earlier habitation of any kind. So all I can say is that we are planning to do excavation in other parts of the city, and hopefully those efforts will help us get information to answer your question. And we did start digging on the eastern side of the city this last summer. Next to the gymnasium, if you can remember the plan in your map, that basically it's it's well on the eastern side of the city. We've started to reveal a Hellenistic house. The pottery associated with that house is very similar to the pottery associated with the Hellenistic house that we've already excavated. But in the surface deposits, we have found at least one example of exactly this same kind of late 5th century pottery that we used to date the earlier phase of the house to the west. So we'll see, but it's quite possible that the classical city was pretty extensive.
Thanks.
Welcome.
And then we have a question in the chat, so I'll read that out.
Okay.
Why are you not permitted to discuss specifics of the coin hoard value at Notion?
Well, it's a very unusual, very special discovery. These coins are known, and hoards of them have been found in various places like Afghanistan, but very, very rarely, and never before in Turkey in a controlled scientific excavation. So the Turkish authorities, the Ministry of Culture, are very wary of drawing attention to a find that could attract looters. And they're also concerned about not sensationalizing, the results of archaeological research. They feel strongly, and I totally agree with them, that finding gold is not the point of scientific archaeology. That said, sometimes it happens, and it can give you a tremendous amount of information. But our site, because we're working there, is protected. We have guards year round, and so we feel reasonably confident that Notion is pretty secure. But and I said to the people in the Ministry of Culture, because for a long time they didn't allow us to publicize this at all, Notion is safe. And they said, yeah, Notion may be safe, but think of all those other archaeological sites that people know about where there isn't any security. There is no excavation, there are no guards. And if you make a big deal about, the gold find at Notion, well, then that may attract looters to less well-protected sites and cause a lot of damage. So in the end, we did, we were given permission to publicize this discovery, but to keep certain details under wraps.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Stephanie, I have a question. Sorry.
Oh,
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ratté. Really, really fascinating stuff. I was really struck by the sort of your good fortune in finding so much datable material in the various rooms there in the house. Was there any evidence of like the process or processes by which they were deposited, left behind in the house, and sort of not cleared out with other kinds of house refuse? Were the floors redone at various points and the datable materials incorporated there?
Well, so there were patches of the floors in these rooms preserved, but over most of the house, the floors were no longer preserved. This particular house sits on a ridge, an exposed ridge, and so it suffered, quite significantly from erosion. So these are not what you would call primary archaeological deposits. what they seem to represent is just what was in each room when the house was abandoned. And there has been there has been erosion, and there has been perturbation caused by the grazing, so their animals are still grazed on the site. So there's been a certain moving around of the artifacts, but nevertheless the clusters coinciding as they do with the boundaries of these rooms do seem to give us pretty clear indications of how the rooms were used. But for this Hellenistic phase, we didn't find any clear evidence for sub-phasing, between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD. It seems as if they basically kept the house pretty clean, and any renovations they did in the last phase pretty much removed evidence for earlier phases. So most of this material is of one period, which is the mid-1st century BC to early 1st century AD.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Carrie, I saw that you had, were you raising your hand?
Yes. Hi. Sorry, I was. Thanks for the talk, Chris. I've really enjoyed it. I just wanted to know anything more that you know about the bronze statue. If there was there any evidence of the metal still in the base, or what can you speculate?
Well, no, I mean, we have a number of these marble bases for bronze statues from around the site. So there's actually another one in the Bouleuterion. It's fragmentary. There's one built into the fortification walls. So, or it's not built into the fortification walls. It's next to the fortification walls. So, not surprisingly, there were bronze statues around here, but they do tend to get torn out of their bases and melted down for other purposes. I mean, I can say that there's also a fair amount of marble sculpture known from the site. Not from our research, but from objects that were just there on the surface, and that were collected by the local museum. And then there were some short-lived archaeological projects at Notion before we started working. So in the 1920s, a French team worked for a season, and then the Turkish team worked for a season, as I said, in the 1980s. And the kind of statue landscape of the city represented by the surviving marble statues is pretty typical for a Hellenistic Greek city in Western Anatolia. And we know from lots of evidence, mainly inscriptions, that dedications of bronze statues, usually honorific statues, so statues of notable citizens, were a common feature of of public squares and civic buildings like the gymnasia of these cities. So presumably there were a bunch of them lying around, but we haven't found any traces. Hope springs eternal. Maybe something will have survived, but probably not. I mean, probably when Notion was largely abandoned in the 1st century AD, scavengers came and over the centuries took away things of value, and certainly big bronze statues have lots of value beyond their status as works of art.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we have a question in the chat. So can you tell us what it costs to run a season at Notion and how that relates to other similar archaeological excavations?
Costs about $220,000 per season. So that's the basic expense of getting the team over there and operating for a field season of about 2 months. And I would say that the average size of the team that we have there is about 50 persons, 20 students, and academic and professional staff, and then a comparable number of workers. whom we hire locally. So the wages of the workers, the cost of maintaining the staff, equipment, travel, and so on adds up to, close to $250,000 annually. We have some additional expenses. The Turkish government does expect you to provide for the security of the site. So those are incremental. So we're building security fences around the site in stages. We haven't been able to find the money to do that all at one go, but we're doing that. We're also expected to provide for safe and secure storage of the movable artifacts that we find in the excavations, and we built a storage depot for that purpose, which cost $90,000 last summer. And we're expected to conserve the buildings that we find and eventually facilitate the development of the site as a heritage destination. So those are all expenses in addition to the basic, basic field research expenses. And in terms of are these kinds of costs typical? Yeah, they're pretty typical for digs like ours. I will say, having participated extensively in two of the other big American digs in Western Anatolia, that were extremely efficient. So we are able to do, an awful lot with the funds at our disposal. So I'm pretty pleased that we have a lean and efficient operation.
Great, thank you so much.
Welcome.
Do we have additional questions?
Well, so don't forget ratte@umich.edu if you want to become a friend of Notion.
Great, and that's in the chat as well. Well, let's see if there's no additional questions. Maybe we'll wrap up for today. Let's see. Okay, well, I want to thank our presenter, Professor Ratté, for being here. Thank you so much for such a wonderful lecture, and I want to thank our audience for some wonderful questions too. Please just keep a lookout for future events on our Kelsey Museum website.
Thank you all very much for your attention and your interest.